Hi, my name is Sean O'Callahan, and I'm Gallatin County's Chief Planning Officer. I'd like to thank you for tuning in to the first part of our multi-part series on Gallatin County's planning framework. Talking about planning and land use tools is not something that most citizens do every day. The goal of this series is to empower citizens to meaningfully participate in our upcoming zoning reform listening sessions. Our goal with this content is to inform. It's not to advocate for any particular outcome or path forward. Part 1 of this series provides a high-level introduction to information. This information is discussed in greater detail in other parts of the series. I'd like to start by discussing expectations for the listening sessions. First, why should the public participate? Gallatin County residents and property owners have a long history of land stewardship and working together with neighbors. This has contributed to a quality of life, a growing economy, and a natural beauty that has attracted increased growth in recent years. In short, Gallatin County residents are interested and passionate about the future of their community. Next, who should participate? Given the rate of change that our community has experienced in recent decades, community members often have strong feelings when it comes to planning and land use and the regulations that are associated with these topics. Conversations in this arena inevitably delve into sensitive topics such as individual and community values, personal rights and responsibilities, and property rights. I'd like to remind everyone at the outset that there are a wide variety of perspectives and opinions in our community on these topics. Regardless of your perspective, we welcome your participation and would love to hear from you. We do, however, ask that you be kind and respectful of other participants when they share a perspective that you disagree with. This is our future, and it's important that we do it together. What will the discussions focus on? At this point, we're wanting to focus the discussion on how zoning is structured and packaged going forward. This certainly implicates the geographic extent of zoning. For example, whether we continue to focus on neighborhood level zoning or whether we look at larger areas of the county. It's premature at this point to focus on the content or substance of zoning regulations. We know that information is of interest to citizens, and we expect we'll hear a lot about that during these listening sessions. Next, what is the county's preferred outcome? In part 4 of this series, several options are presented, along with some of the benefits, drawbacks, and challenges associated with each option. This information reveals that some options are likely more achievable than others. I'd like to emphasize that the county does not have a preconceived solution or path forward. We're starting this process by listening. Lastly, when will a decision be made? No decisions are being made in the listening sessions. At some point after the listening sessions conclude, the County Commission will provide direction to the Planning Department on whether they want to investigate options other than the framework that is currently in place. What do you mean when you talk about the county's planning framework? Planning framework is the total combination of all the laws, policies, and regulations that influence or otherwise direct how planning decisions are made. In summary, laws enable local governments to plan and to adopt regulations to implement those plans. As a general powers government, Gallatin County can only do what the law gives us authority to do. And Montana law has created several tools that allow the local government and residents to have a say in what happens in their communities. These tools work together to protect against negative impacts such as impact on properties, agriculture, water, local services, the natural environment, and public health and safety. These tools are intended to ensure that residents can continue to enjoy their properties and their quality of life. These tools generally fall into 2 different buckets. First is non-regulatory tools. These are generally known as plans or policies, and they set forth goals and objectives and policies to implement those goals and objectives. They're non-regulatory in nature. We have a growth policy that sets forth the county's land use goals at largely a county-wide scale. We have neighborhood plans that provide the same type of information, but in a limited geographic extent of the county, and they generally provide the information at a higher level of detail than would be described in the growth policy. Next, we have topical plans, like a trails plan or a transportation plan, and they focus on a specific topic and provide information related to that topic for all or part of the county. Next, we have regulatory tools like subdivision regulations, building for lease or rent regulations, or zoning district regulations. I'd like to point out at this stage the county has 22 different zoning district regulations in effect at this point in time. Each of those regulations operates independently of one another. As the graphic on the right-hand side of the slide shows, this is a layered system, and these tools often work in conjunction with one another to influence planning decisions. To give a little bit more information about the regulatory tools, this slide describes the purpose of each. Subdivision regulations provide requirements to divide land so that title to the property can be transferred to another person or entity. So to split up land in order to sell some or all of it. The building for lease or rent regulations address situations where multiple buildings exist on a single piece of property, and those buildings are rented or leased to someone other than the property owner. Last, zoning regulations. They address how property can be used, for example, whether it can be used for residential or commercial purposes. They include standards for development, like how far from a property line a building has to be, or how tall a building can be. And they also provide some procedural requirements for the review of different kinds of projects. For example, some projects are approved at the staff or administrative level. Other projects might require a public hearing. It's important to recognize that formulation and adoption of these regulations includes a public process. There's lots of opportunity for public input into the creation and development of each of these regulations. Next, what does the planning framework of the county look like in a spatial sense? First, we have to recognize that approximately 40% of the county is comprised of publicly owned land, and our planning framework doesn't apply there. The county has limited ability to influence actions that occur on public land. Next, similar to public lands, we have to understand that the county's planning framework doesn't include the entire county. For example, the areas shown in red and pink on the map on the right include the municipalities of Bozeman, Belgrade, Manhattan, Three Forks, and West Yellowstone. We don't have jurisdiction in those areas, nor do we have jurisdiction in the extraterritorial planning areas around Belgrade, Manhattan, or Three Forks. When you look at what's left, we have a few different categories. Shown as orange on the map are the unzoned parts of the county. Similarly, unzoned parts of the county that are covered by a neighborhood plan are shown in yellow. Shown in the light purple and darker purple are parts of the county that are currently covered by a zoning district. Next, we have conserved lands. These are shown in bright green, and they're lands within the county that are covered by a conservation easement. As you can see, different parts of the county, different parts of the planning framework will apply differently. So why is the county focusing the discussion on zoning? Throughout the county's history, communities have developed tools like zoning district regulations and neighborhood plans. Generally, these are developed in response to a specific proposal or event that was seen as a threat to the quality of life and enjoyment of property of residents. First, zoning regulations are the county's most numerous land use regulations, and arguably the most impactful. As already stated, there are 22 zoning regulations in place, and they operate largely independently of one another. For example, common terminology such as how the word dwelling is defined, is subject to different definitions in different zoning regulations. Uses, development densities, and development standards are also different across the various zoning districts in the county. The rules that apply to an area that's zoned as rural residential in one zoning district could be very different than the rules that apply in another zoning district that is also labeled as being rural residential. The system is difficult to administer and maintain, but it also creates confusion for property owners and members of the public as they're trying to navigate zoning requirements, or even doing something like searching for a property that allows for a specific business or use. Second, some of the county's zoning regulations date back to the 1970s. While this history of local, impactful land use planning is something to be proud of, it's also something to look at closely. For many of these zoning regulations, the content is largely the same as when they were first adopted. We have to ask ourselves whether these regulations are still relevant and meeting the needs of the community. For example, are the regulations adequate in dealing with emerging issues, such as gravel pits, short-term rentals, marijuana cultivation, personal solar and wind generation, cell towers? The list goes on and on. Similarly, we have to consider whether the regulations are consistent with case law or directives handed out by the legislature. To date, zoning has largely been accomplished in Gallatin County at a neighborhood scale, meaning it has been implemented to address concerns in relatively small, distinct geographic parts of the county. This has resulted in gaps in the framework. In fact, only 26% of the private land in the county's jurisdictional area is zoned. This leaves large areas of the county where land use is largely at the discretion of the individual landowner. Many people may view this situation as a benefit when they wish to do something with their property, but can discover it's a hindrance when a neighbor wishes to use their property in a way that impacts others. When zoning is enacted at a neighborhood scale, there is a hyperlocal focus on needs and issues, and the same topics aren't considered at a county-wide scale, which is important when considering everyday matters like the demand for housing or even the need to mine gravel to support the construction of houses. This slide shows a list of the zoning districts that are in existence in the county. You'll note some of them go back to the early 70s. And the map shows their location across the county. The county continues to hear from residents that are interested in establishing zoning to protect their properties and their quality of life. We've essentially been addressing these requests and concerns the same way since the 1970s and taking a very piecemeal approach. After over 50 years of doing it this way, it's time to have a conversation about this approach and ultimately decide if we should continue with the status quo or whether it's time to try something different. Again, this presentation is just the introduction to a 4-part series. Thanks for tuning in, but please be sure to tune into the rest of the series to learn more. The listening sessions on zoning reform are scheduled for February 18th and March 13th and 25th, and they provide an opportunity for citizens to share their feedback with county officials and staff. Planning is local, and your participation is valuable. Here are some ways you can stay informed and engaged with what the county is doing. Thanks again.